activist, so on my far left here. You're right. She is currently studying at Harvard Divinity School for her Master of Theology degree, focusing on queer theology and Mormon studies. She's the founder and board president of the Rainbow Collection. Is that pronounced right, even with the Y in the middle of it? Okay, it's spelled rainbow with a Y in the middle. A nonprofit focused on supporting LGBTQ plus BYU students. Second, we'll have Jared Bennett. Jared Bennett is a graduate student at Utah State University in history, studying religious experience in Latter-day Saint temples between 1836 and the 1940s. I was reading his thesis on the plane on the way down here. He will be defending it on Wednesday. Is that when we're doing it? All right, on Wednesday. So you can give him a presumptive congratulations. Paul Bryner is a recent graduate from Brigham Young University in Ancient Near East Studies and is employed as a research assistant at Scripture Central. He'll begin a JD degree at the University of Utah in the fall of 2024 and enjoys studying ancient languages, theology, and Russian literature. And finally, we have Kyle David, is it Belanger?
Yes.
Excellent, I guessed correctly. Who's a first-year Master of Theological Studies candidate at Harvard Divinity School, where he studies post-Enlightenment religious history and theology, Jewish-Christian relations, and the Holocaust. He graduated with honors in classics and history from BYU in 2023. So we will we'll have all four of their papers, and then hopefully we'll have time for a Q&A at the very end. So I'll turn it over to Maddison.
All righty. Is it working over there yet? Love. Okay. We'll see if my laptop will. Slideshow. Play from start. She's thinking about it. All right. Are we good?
Yes.
Perfect. Hi, y'all. My name is Maddison Tenney. I am, like he said, at Harvard Divinity School, and I wanted to talk today about what is known and unknown about LGBTQ plus salvation within Mormon theology. So just to give you a preference of like, who is she and why does she think she can write about this? I am a Latter-day Saint. I served a full-time LDS mission in Philadelphia in 2018. I attended Brigham Young University, where I received my bachelor's degree, and I'm here at Harvard Divinity School with my master's. I also, during my time at BYU, started the Rainbow Collective, which if you want to talk to me about it after, I'm happy to. But it was from those experiences at BYU and on my mission that I really started to think about what is our practical theology, what's the function of our faith, and how do we use Mormonism in contemporary society. I'm also an artist, and most recently I was working on this piece. It's called Holy Divine. And as I was working with the clay, I started to think about the ways that I held both my queerness and my Mormonism in both hands. Now, to me, my identity and my sexuality and my religion seem completely legible. I don't feel a divide between the two. I am who I am, and this is the body and who I am, and like, that's fine. But as I've been both at BYU and at Harvard Divinity School, both in Latter-day Saint spaces and non-Latter-day Saint spaces, I found myself having to make myself legible to my audiences. I'm often too Mormon for queer spaces and too queer for Mormon spaces. And so this work in particular, with ceramics, it offers us to hold a space or to have a vessel. And so I hope with this presentation to create a vessel or a space that we can think about queerness and Mormonism as being co-joined and not separate. These are the, I'm just gonna give you an overview of my argument because I love a little organization. First, I'm gonna go over some definitions that come with the study of queer theory, and then I'm gonna talk about some of Mormonism's foundational arguments. Then I'll talk about how we function as a faith, and then lastly, I'll give my conclusion. Now, when I say Mormonism, I know that recently our prophet has asked us to use the term Latter-day Saint, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something much bigger. As you can see from my graph, I define Mormonism as the sort of space created both through an internal culture, through the external culture's pressure on that internal culture, and also the input of the institution or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Out of these three organizing bodies comes our rites, rituals, and practices, our doctrine, policy, our sacred text, and our structures of authority. It's impossible to conceive of Mormonism just as with the membership of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, just as it's impossible to conceive of Mormonism without the institution. We need both, and that includes both practicing members, non-practicing members, those who grew up in the faith, those who grew up around the faith, and those who are no longer practicing. So, what is the lay of the land here? Let's talk about it. So when I say to be a Mormon, or Mormonism in this presentation, refers to the culture and the theology created by those who have a relation to, have lived within, or are practicing members of the institutional Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Here I'm specifying the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, different from among the 60 breakoffs that came from the Prophet Joseph Smith's teachings. When I say queer theory, what I'm talking about is a guiding set of methodologies thinking about life, activism, and academic practice that come from the lived experiences of LGBTQ+ folks and the academic field of study around gender, queerness, and embodiment. Now, and here's the hard one. When I say queer, what does that mean? And can we even say it? Well, we can. It's been reclaimed. And so when I say to queer something, first, as a method, to queer is to make peace with the constantly changing motion of all things. It's a commitment to not cling too closely to how we think things should be defined by the norms of gender or sexuality, but to embrace the possibilities of what it would look to have a livable life, as said by Judith Butler. Or when I say queer as a sexuality, what I'm talking about is to have a queer sexuality can, one, act as an identity marker that, let's be frank, means many things to many people, but ultimately at its core reflects a commitment and a gender or sexuality that is not contained within heterosexuality. So we can think of like heterosexuality and queer. Next, I'm going to talk about communal salvation and universal salvation. These are some fundamental teachings of the Church of Jesus Christ that I'll focus on in my presentation, but I'd like to define them for us and with what it means. Communal salvation refers to the teachings in the Temple, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the contemporary church teachings taught at baptism that we commit to build a Zion community. Nobody within LDS theology can achieve salvation on one's own. It is always in community with one another. And then lastly, universal salvation. This refers to the LDS Mormon doctrine that everyone will have equal access to salvation and the gospel, irrespective of their earthly experiences, and that the gospel is not denied to anybody who wishes to receive it. This is emphasized with the ordinances we perform in the temple, alongside the church's practice of missionary work. So when I talk about Mormonism's foundational claims, what am I talking about? So to do the work of queering, as practiced by Judith Butler and others, they invite us to return to the original texts and foundational claims of a community, so we can then engage with the community's beliefs, practices, and texts about gender and sexuality on their own contextual terms. So within this presentation, I'm using terms and arguments legible to Mormonism that come from Mormonism. So what are these foundational claims? First, I believe that we have an open and expanding canon, and this is shown by our Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, Book of Abraham, General Conference, etc. Second, that we have personal revelation, both individually and institutionally. And I cite this from the first vision, that in calling and recalling Joseph, that God shows us that we all have both an individual relationship with the divine that goes two ways. That I can receive revelation straight from God about my standing with the divine, and that individuals can receive revelation for other people. Then, communal and universal salvation. And I say this through the ordinances, that we commit to a Zion community, and we also believe in post-life progression. Just as we cannot imagine the historical Christ outside of his lived context, we cannot conceptualize the LDS Church separate from its historical and temporal context. So I'm just going to go over some literature talking about gender and sexuality, what we know and what we don't know, that's some recent scholarship. First, I'm going to talk about Tabernacles of Clay by Taylor Petrie. Taylor argues that the church's fear over changing social attitudes about gender reveals how fragile gender is as a concept, both within LDS praxis and theology. As gender roles and meanings have changed over time, so has LDS engagement with them. And this is critical. I'm talking specifically in the American context. This reveals not a solid theology about gender and sexuality, but rather a reactive one, based around fears of change within the American socio-political context, to which the LDS Church has defended homonormative cisgender gender roles. So when I say homonormative, what I'm saying is that we assume that everyone is, when I say heteronormative, I mean that we assume everyone's heterosexual. And when I say cisgender, it's with the assumption that everyone is born with an identifiable sex at birth, and then they live that sex at birth throughout the rest of their lives to what they're assigned at birth. So let's talk about gender roles. So when we look at the original arguments for heterosexuality in Mormonism, it's helpful and also, you guys, so complicated because we practice polygamy and the institutional church's focus on gender roles and not as much on biological sex. Homosexuality in that framework is a threat to American patriarchal heterosexual gender roles, which has become the focus of the contemporary church, which I define as 1930s to now. The church's most explicit and central document in favor of patriarchal heterosexual gender roles comes from its 1990 document, The Family Proclamation to the World, which was written in reaction to Hawaii's legalization of LGBTQ+ marriage. The next text I'm going to talk about is Blair Ostler's Queer Mormon Theology. So in Queer Mormon Theology, Blair Ostler takes the practice of polygamy seriously as a salvific practice and does a historical analysis of all the different types of sealings that were performed from the Kirtland to the Nauvoo period. What would it mean, and in the text they ask, what would it mean to engage with polygamy as a theology of salvation rather than tying it solely to reproduction? Ostler then imagines the full impact and potential of queering polygamy as a way to join families, friends, and communities across time for eternity. If our salvation is tied to each other, Blair argues, let it tie all of us, and let us explore its entire role of possibilities. Some of the kinds of sealings that Blair talks about that happened were in the Nauvoo period, specifically spouse-to-spouse sealings, parent-to-child sealings, law of adoption sealings, and friendship sealings. And Blair cites all of this in the text as sealings that were enacted before the move to Utah. And lastly, I'll be drawing from Taylor Petrie's most recent and upcoming work, Queering Kinship in the Mormon Cosmos. So in this text, Petrie claims that in going from his argument Tabernacles of Clay, that the theology and relationships of across textual Mormonism reflect a kinship model rather than solely like a marital model. Petrie looks at the scriptural foundation of Adam and Eve's gendering, the genders of the divine, and the family proclamation. By working through their scriptural claims, Petrie concludes that Mormon cosmology does not offer a single story of nature and of the human being, the ontological status of sexual difference, the importance of gender, or the ideal configuration of relationships. From its appearance in the 19th century up to the present, Mormonism's cosmological drama of human progress toward divinity has been simultaneously in collaboration with and commentary on and a critique of the broader culture to which Mormonism has belonged. Okay, that was a lot. Now let's talk about my claim. So, coming back to LDS praxis and theology, when we look at the foundational claims of Mormonism, what then is the function of the LGBTQ+ exclusion related to our salvific claims? So when we exclude queer folks, how does that function within what we proclaim with our salvation? And because this is a conference on embodiment, I just want to quickly reference us to what's going on with the bodies of queer folks within Mormonism. Let's talk about electroshock conversion therapy that happened at BYU, the Prop 8 support in California, the exclusion for queer folks for temple ordinances, and then lastly, the practice of LDS conversion therapy. How can we practice a universal gospel or a communal salvation when, as an institution, the LDS Church has routinely implemented practices that, 1, actively cause harm, 2, enforce exclusion, and 3, discriminate against God's children? Either our salvation is not universal nor communal, or at a theological level, we need to take seriously the function of our salvific claims. So what does this look like, and how do we do this? And here I come back to the Book of Mormon. In this text in 2nd Nephi, we read how God invites all of us to accept the gospel and that God denies none that come unto him. And then there's use of different sort of identity markers, black and white, bond and free, male and female. And here remember the heathen and all are alike unto God, both Jew and Gentile. Even though in this text there's references to gender and race, the function of the text isn't actually to draw attention to gender and race, right? The function of the text is to remind us that all are invited to come unto God, irrespective of the labels that we as humanity put on them. This is super serious in the Book of Mormon, right? This is like the pivotal moment of 3rd Nephi. Like when I was a missionary in Philadelphia, this was the text I read. This is the text that helped people understand what we were about. It's time, as theologians and as saints, we take our foundational claims seriously, and we allow our theology to be peculiar in how it invites all people to partake of its goodness. Then we think about, okay, well, what other commitments have we made? Well, at baptism, we make a commitment in Mosiah 18 to bear one another's burdens and to mourn with those that mourn. to comfort those that stand in need of comfort, and to stand as witnesses of God at all times, in all things, and in all places, even until death, that we may be redeemed of God. In this text specifically, the redemption of God comes after we mourn with those that mourn. It comes because of our relationality. It comes because we take care of each other. To be in the fold of God is to provide care. And this is what I like to call, and what I've called in my scholarship, the Mormon ethic of care. We really do take seriously this commitment to build our Zion community. And that's why, to me, as being a queer Mormon, it's so jarring that we would ever have any form of exclusion be within our dogma or our practice. Because this is what we're promising at baptism. And either we really mean this promise, or we don't. And both are really interesting, but this is what we claim. So, what would this even look like? What would this look like on the ground, day to day? Here I'm going to use the model proposed by Lynn Marie Tonstad in Christian Theology Beyond Apologetics. So resources for moving forward. First, let's really look critically at the Book of Mormon definitions of salvation and community. How is it working? What is the function of salvation in these communities? And how can we use that to rethink about our faith practice today? Next, we have an open canon. So let's write some sacred text, y'all. Like, for a journaling community, we really got to be better. And I'm really serious about this. Let's have more scholarship. Let's get really creative. Let's fall in love with our sacred texts, and let's write some more. Next, I propose that we practice a sacred practice of inclusion, that we see both our buildings and our communities and the way we invite people into them and take care of them as sacred and as salvific. Because if we're not saved within community, we aren't saved at all. I'd like us to question our fundamental assumptions, a sort of Euclidean geometry sort of thing of like, what are we assuming, right? When I come into a space, what assumptions am I making about that space? And what questions can we ask about those assumptions? And will that lead us closer to God? And lastly, vulnerability. I think vulnerability is critical, and we've got to do better at organizing. So in conclusion, here are our foundational claims: open and expanding canon, personal revelation, and communal and universal salvation. So some ways of doing this, of just addressing what's going on the ground. Both pro-inclusion arguments and exclusion arguments have been made from the pulpit, but there's no textual address of consenting homosexuality between adults in our sacred texts. Personal revelation, queer members such as I have received personal revelation that our salvation is good. And we also have institutional that have argued against LGBTQ salvation. Let's work with that. And then lastly, we currently have unreliable administration of access to ordinances, also called bishop roulette. We lack inclusion. We have both inclusion and exclusion of the community, right? Some folks are great, some are not. And then lastly, we believe in post-life relationality. So create new sacred texts, and also let's follow Joseph Smith's experience, believing that no institution can deny anyone's personal divine revelation from God. Can everyone be saved, or can they be not saved? Can we take our belief in creating a Zion community seriously? Can we embrace the unknown with love and creativity? Mormonism's foundational claims queered Christianity. They offered us intimate relationality to embodied divinity, an embrace of individual relation, and universal salvation. We can re-enlive our theology, faith, and community by embracing the innate queerness of Mormonism's foundational claims. Thank you.
So I'm calling this a comparative theology based on something that I think that Francis Clooney says about comparative theology being about going and engaging with another tradition's texts and traditions, and then coming back to your own and looking at it again. So this sort of journey, if you will, started with encountering this text in Moses 7, where Enoch is describing how he's watching God cry, and he doesn't quite understand how that's possible if God is so eternal and so holy and so great, how it's possible that God could cry tears. So this sounded a little familiar to me, and I wanted to go back into Jewish tradition and see where I might have sort of encountered this idea, or where I might find something similar to this idea of a God that actually cares, to put it bluntly. So first, in kind of a, maybe it's what Jeremiah is saying, maybe it's not, open question. We have this description of listen carefully and call the weeping women and let them come, and send for skilled ones and let them come, and wail for us, that our eyes run with tears. Now, you could read this as Jeremiah. You could read this as God is actually saying this, and it's not sort of God telling Jeremiah what to say as Jeremiah. And in the chapter beforehand, you have this line, I will weep day and night for the slain of my people. And on its face, it seems like it's Jeremiah saying this, but this is subject to something of a rabbinic joke, where they say, who said this? If you say Jeremiah, can he not eat? Can he not sleep? Who possibly could have said this? Who doesn't eat and who does not eat and does not rest? And so they bring this line from Psalms, the guardian of Israel does not sleep nor slumber. To them, it's pretty obvious that it's God that's crying day and night. So the question that came out of this for me was, what kind of a God then is God? Sort of against what the Maimonideans might say about God's impassibility, which we've heard a little bit about earlier. So this is sort of the sticking point for me of God's self-description in Exodus on Mount Sinai, where he describes himself as a God merciful and compassionate, slow to anger, and full of loving kindness and truth. A teacher of mine made a point that God is describing himself as someone who is compassionate, who gets angry, not someone who is angry and can be compassionate. Then we have in Deuteronomy, where fairly famous, where God says, who is not partial and takes no bribes, and who does justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the strangers. And then right after this, he says, and so should you. And Ibn Ezra, who is a commentator on the Torah, and he goes with sort of the surface level meaning and the grammar. He doesn't sort of delve deeper into more mystical readings. He says, even though God is exalted, he does justice for orphans and widows. And because God loves the stranger, so should you. And not just should you, but you, the word he uses is chiyuv. You are obligated to do so. And then again, in Jeremiah, we see God saying, may I, where he's describing the sort of pain that he's in over not just what's happening to widows and orphans and strangers, but what's happening to his people Israel when, they did something wrong, but he's describing sort of, I will not be silent, for the sound of a trumpet I heard, alarms of war, even though nominally this is God's punishment for what they've done wrong. So we're seeing this sort of idea that God is compassionate, he's feeling, and he gets angry. There's a text in a commentary on I believe, Deuteronomy, where they say, do you wish to know the one who spoke and the world came to be, which is God? And they don't say that you should study the law, they say you should learn Agada, which is the sort of stories that are told about. The rabbis will find some grammatical something, or some word, and they'll spin out a story about why it's that way, or they believe the Torah doesn't say the same thing twice, so they'll go and they'll read the second instance of something a different way. And this was finally what I was reminded of with Moses 7. They're discussing in Chronicles where the Israelites are going to battle, and they're singing what is a very common refrain in Psalms, give thanks to God for his loving kindnesses forever. And usually you end it with, for he is good. And they ask, why not? And Rabbi Yonatan says, because there is no joy for God in the downfall of the wicked. And they tell another Agada about this same sort of idea, and this is sort of where the the remembering came in. As Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman said, that Rabbi Yonatan said, "What does it mean it is written, and one did not come near the other all night?" Now, in the text, it's just the two armies, the Egyptian army and the Israelite army, or their camps, did not come near each other the night. They're reading it as a ministering angel that wanted to sing to God over the Egyptians being drowned in the sea and sort of the final redemption of the Israelites out of Egypt. And God silences the angel and says, "The work of my hands drowns in the sea, and you sing before me." This sort of feeds into this. There's a name that the rabbis will use for God, Rahmana, which means the compassionate one in Aramaic, and it's the only Aramaic name that they will use for him, despite speaking Aramaic. And compassion in English, it comes from Latin suffering with, so not just this idea of sort of empathy, but sort of something deeper where we wouldn't want to think of God as suffering in sort of a classical theistic way, or Maimonides doesn't want to think of God as suffering, but the rabbis were not afraid of this. In explaining why God speaks out of the thorns, out of the bush of thorns, he said, the Holy One, blessed be he, which is how they refer to God most of the time, "Do you not sense that I am suffering just as Israel is suffering? Know the place from which I speak to you, from the thorns, as it were, I am with them in their suffering." And then there's another sort of explanation of every time Israel is exiled, the divine presence goes with them. So the divine presence is supposed to be in Jerusalem, but every time Israel is exiled out of sort of the land, the divine presence follows them. And at the end, when they're returned, the divine presence will come back with them. So they're never sort of alone. God and the divine presence are always with them in their suffering. And then this is a sort of a more modern quote, so out of the 200s, 300s, 400s CE. Coming modern now. Yitz Greenberg is the teacher, one of my teachers, in a book called Between, or For the Sake of Heaven and Earth, where he sort of reimagines what Christian-Jewish dialogue might look like. He says that the Talmudic and Kabbalistic traditions grasp that going through exile without losing oneself constitutes imitatio Dei, imitation of God, of the highest order. In an unredeemed world with a suffering humanity, God is also out of sorts and in pain. Yet the Lord persists in presence, comforting the afflicted, upholds eternal values, and works indefatigably toward liberation and perfection. That's all I have.
Get this plugged in here. Is it working? Oh, there it is. All right, I'll get my timer. All right, really happy to be here today. About 2 years ago, I read The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky, and I thought it was fascinating on a lot of levels. I can skip my intro here. Most people know him from Crime and Punishment, his most famous novel, and some of the psychological elements of it. But he takes on a lot of really heavy themes in his novels, like the existence of God, why bad things happen, contemporary Russian issues. But his final novel, The Brothers Karamazov, is probably his most theologically provocative, and I read up about it and found some interesting statements he made before he wrote the novel. He wrote in a letter to a friend before he authored it that he was going to offer a steel man argument, that is the opposite of a straw man, the strongest possible argument he could for atheism in his novel he was writing. And then in the same book, he wanted to match that and provide an answer for it. He said, "Those blockheads have never even conceived so powerful a rejection of God as exists in the Inquisitor, That's one of the chapters. And the preceding chapter, to which the whole book will serve as answer. In Dostoevsky's novel, Ivan Karamazov makes this powerful argument that's very well organized, an anti-theodicy, we might call it, that made people wonder if Dostoevsky really was a Christian. That's been debated continually since the novel came out. But he wrote, after that forceful argument against God came out, that the response to it wasn't going to be a direct point-for-point answer, but rather an oblique one, so to speak, in artistic form. And because of that, it takes a little bit of authorial license to reconstruct what his argument was. Quick review for us here. The problem of evil, as it's defined with classical theism, is the seeming logical contradiction between God's omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and the existence of evil, right? And we might say that there are some unassumed premises in there, like that omnipotence means, no logical limits, or that omnibenevolence means eliminating good insofar as it's possible. Theodicies, then, coming from, theos, God, and DK, justice, would mean justifying God and trying to resolve this contradiction. So typically that's done by qualifying one of the claims from the problem of evil. A philosopher named Nick Trakakis wrote a paper called Antitheodicy, where he uses that term and uses it to describe arguments that question the ethical merits rather than the logical merits of making a theodicy. Some of the most compelling premises of that argument are that, one, believing that God compensates suffering disincentivizes us from preventing evil in the world. That's been mentioned earlier. And then also, if he does allow evil, maybe he's not omnibenevolent. Maybe he's not worthy of our worship. And people who promote these theories are, doing an unethical action. So he takes it from a logical to a moral ground and says, that we need to be careful with these arguments because the moral implications of them can have far-reaching effects. So how does Dostoevsky formulate an anti-theodicy? One of his characters, Ivan Karamazov, gives this parable, he calls it, called the Grand Inquisitor, where Jesus comes and visits medieval Spain when it has a theocratic government and starts healing people. He's immediately taken in by the leadership and imprisoned and told that because he refused to use his divine power to take control of the world and prevent suffering, they did it themselves in his absence and they don't need him anymore, with the implication that humanity, or that character, loves mankind, loves humans more than God or Jesus did. The atrocities committed to children, in particular, are too extreme to ever be forgiven, even if they are compensated. And talking about heaven, he says, I most respectfully return the ticket, saying that even if God does exist, he thinks there's moral problems there. How does Dostoevsky answer that? I need a good term for a response to anti-theodicy. Anti-theodicy felt a little too far. So if you have any suggestions, I'd love to hear them. Rather than making a point-for-point claim, like he said, he seems to answer it, from what I've gotten in most authors and reviews I've read of the book, by looking at the trajectory of the characters, rather than saying this is why this is wrong. He looks at what philosophies characters operate on, and then shows what the characters do and their morality. So in the novel, it's that character Ivan who presents that aggressive argument against God, becomes very morally dubious and contributes to his father's death, as well as other problems. Though accepting that is just kind of an act of faith almost, right? This author, Victor Terrace, says, the success or failure of Dostoevsky's Theodicy depends on the reader's acceptance of Dostoevsky's metaphysical anthropology. So we could just take it at his word that disbelieving in God will cause us to be less ethical. But I tried to milk out why he might be saying that in the novel and look at some of the underlying themes. And I have reconstructed or just originally constructed what I think his argument is in this novel. So I've taken some liberties here. I think he agrees with these first two premises that are proposed by that evil does exist, absolutely, and that humans, because they are good, like we were saying God is, have a moral imperative to eliminate evil as far as we can. And then he leaves the conversation of God and God's traits and instead comes to this practical question. He theorizes that if someone believes in God, requests divine love from God, and receives it, they will be more motivated and enabled to eliminate evil than in any other way. And if that experiment does turn out to be true, then they would secondarily know that God exists and has some degree of goodness and would therefore be justified in making a theodicy. So he doesn't offer any kind of reason for why evil may happen, but rather this process to figure out if it's moral to defend God. Right? Obviously, a lot hinges on that third one. Right there, some concessions we'd make up front. There are certainly harmful ways of doing theodicy. Right, like George Hanley talked about earlier. You can do it in a way that remits your accountability and or invalidates the suffering of others. An author I read, Bethany Solerator, talks about how we need to have a compassionate theodicy that blends emotion and theory. I think that's a given. And not everyone who claims to be filled with divine love will actually decrease suffering more than they, increase it. And that, I think, is also something of a given. But this argument isn't very universal. It takes its power from a personal sphere and says that you can figure this out for yourself, but we're not going to make any kind of universal claims that you can't individually test. So Dostoevsky argues against this primarily through a Christian character in the novel named Elder Zosima, who's very selfish and caring to others. And he talks about how loving is very difficult. Well, Ivan has this very abstract love for mankind that breaks down in individual situations. He thinks that we need to focus on actively loving, that's the term he usually uses, active love, those who are nearest to us and those who are hardest to love. And he notes that it requires extreme effort on our part, but also a divine component. A few quotes from him. He says, "Brothers, one must know how to acquire love, for she is acquired with effort, purchased dearly, by long labor and over a long season. For it is not simply for a casual moment that one must love, but for the whole of the appointed season. After all, anyone is capable of loving casually, even the doer of evil." However, there is a divine component here beyond our own agency. He says, "I prophesy to you that at that very moment you behold with horror that in spite of all your efforts, not only have you failed to move towards your goal of love, but even seem to have grown more remote from it. At that very moment, I prophesy to you, you will suddenly reach that goal and discern clearly above you the miracle-working power of the Lord, who has loved you all along." I think that corresponds well with the Book of Mormon's teachings on charity. Nephi talks about how charity is a commandment, evidently something within our own agency and ability. However, Mormon, in a sermon that looks similar to 1 Corinthians 12, talks about how we need to pray for charity, and it has to be given by the Father. He says, "Wherefore, my beloved brethren, pray unto the Father with all the energy of heart, that ye may be filled with this love, which he hath bestowed upon all who are true followers of his Son, Jesus Christ, that ye may become the sons of God, that when he shall appear, we shall be like him." So evidently, the Latter-day Saint conception of charity also has both an agency element and an intervention element. But what does that mean? Charity is still pretty broad and hard to define. It's nice that they both agree on the gift aspect and the choice aspect, but reading through the novel, I noticed a few beliefs that Dostoevsky seems to correlate with a belief in charity, either caused by it or causing it. A few that he suggests are belief in God and immortality of the soul, radical accountability, as I would term it, for the soul. There's several other references like this where Dostoevsky talks about how loving others and attempting to be filled with divine love is a way that we learn that God is real and that our soul is immortal. And as far as you advance in love, you will grow sure of the reality of God. However, he also makes the controversial claim that that God grounds our morality metaphysically. If you have no God, what is the meaning of crime? That sounds like Korihor in the Book of Mormon, who believes both in an absence of afterlife and a moral relativity. Whatsoever a man did was no crime, and when a man was dead, that was the end thereof. I wouldn't suggest that people without a belief in God or an afterlife have no morality, but I do think that he makes a great point that having a metaphysical grounding for your reality, your morality, to make it absolute, does strengthen one's ethics, provided those are correct. Radical accountability, like George Hanley talked about earlier, it's easy to kind of wave away our responsibility with theodicies. Zosima's suggestion might go beyond Latter-day Saint doctrine. He says, there's only one means of salvation. Take yourself and make yourself responsible for all men's sins, and you will see that it is really so. That seems radical. In some ways, that's Jesus' job, right? He took on the sins of the world. But I think that, like Simon of Cyrene depicted here, we also have a responsibility to help carry his cross, even though he can do it himself in many ways. We certainly believe in group accountability in Latter-day Saint thought. We're not punished for Adam's transgressions or those of others, but we do believe that, as the D&C, the Doctrine and Covenants says, we have to take
historical contingency of revealed knowledges. Here's how I intend to proceed. So we'll begin with a foray into Feuerbach and the problems for embodiment, especially as it relates to the McConkie-Eugene England debate in the 70s and 80s. And then I'll propose a theory of situated revelations rooted in radical historical contingency, to borrow Haraway's language. And then finally, I'll conclude briefly with some pastoral implications for why I think this is important for how we care for our congregations. So to begin with Feuerbach, his concept of God as projection and predicate is very important for understanding what it means to make us the subject of our understanding of God. Here's an example of what Feuerbach is saying. The consciousness of God is the self-consciousness of man. The knowledge of God is the self-knowledge of man. Man's notion of himself is his notion of God, just as his notion of God is his notion of himself. The two are man's own soul. What is man's spirit, soul, and heart, that is his God. And I think as we continue the limitations of our language for embodiment, the gendered language here retains its force in terms of what is not in the conversation. So the problem for Feuerbach and his heirs, including most famously Marx, is twofold. First, Feuerbach argues that the concept of God alienates from us our own profound human capabilities to reimagine and recreate the world, since God is located beyond the sphere of human action. Second, the position of subject who generates the predicate of God is contested, political, and historically volatile, which dislocates God's unity in a myriad of refracted articulations that are indexed according to material struggles of power and also to representation of persons and ideas in the sphere of alienation, which is what Marx draws on for an aside. But in its assertion that God the Father is eternally embodied in roughly the same way that we are, comprising a human form in whose image we all were made, Latter-day Saint theology significantly heightens the stakes of God's body, especially given the highly racialized discourse in which Mormonism emerges in the 19th century. Understanding the stake of God's embodiment, both father and mother, as site for representation is essential as we consider that universal ideals inscribe into each of us a degree of difference to an ideal body, which in turn makes normative a particular rendering that depends upon the extent to which someone occupies the position of subject and is therefore more or less represented in the divine. What's ultimately at stake in God's body is how these normative ideals, presented as universalizable to all people, stake a claim upon each of us through the authority of revelation. This is precisely what's at stake for Bruce R. McConkie in the Seven Deadly Heresies, when he asserts that when he rejects that God is still progressing in knowledge. For McConkie, God still progresses through dominion in us, but has achieved an ultimate stasis of knowledge and stature that in turn stabilizes the universe. We become the site of God's eternal lives, according to McConkie, by progressing in respective degrees depending upon our faithfulness toward a stable ideal that God already embodies. Eugene England, in his response, associates McConkie's position with God's capacity for progression, about God's capacity for progression with Orson Pratt's, who was mentioned earlier, four of whose beliefs, as I list here, and I won't read aloud since, for time's sake, Brigham Young specifically condemns, but that basically Brigham Young locates God's identity in a very particularly finite, learning, progressing, not fully knowing all things sort of personality. Contra Orson Pratt, Brigham Young was deeply concerned with what he calls lariating or roping off God, which is to assert that God is bounded in his capacity for knowledge, that somehow knowledge can exist apart from the quest for it and be wholly located in God, vis-a-vis more traditional Christian understandings. What I propose in this four-way conversation, McConkie, England, Pratt, Young, is that God's quest for knowledge is necessarily tied up with historically contingent material reality, and that we in our embodied mortal experiences are the situated sites or quests to reveal new knowledge both to us and to God. We in turn become revelation to God as God learns more about the universe through the mystery of us, insofar as we are not fully determined on account of our therefore self-determining, apart from God as eternal intelligences. In one sense, this position is an extension of McConkie's assertion that God progresses in dominion, though I resist the imperious vocabulary to a degree. But I think relationship is a more apt description. God progresses in knowledge through expanding his scope of relationality, placing new weight upon Elder Kieran's recent and widely quoted phrase that God is in relentless pursuit of us. Yet relationality is situated in our own experience as we body forth, in a verbal and inchoate sense, our own mortality that is in turn a site of revelation. This is what I am calling situated revelations. We've now arrived at our vocabulary, a theory that suggests that since knowing depends upon the body, not yet, we must build responsible definitions and methodologies of revelation by building from the body up, beginning with individual people and their histories and local contexts, rather than from abstractions and idealisms that we impose from the top down. To work from a situation to a principle rather than from principle to situation, unlocated and unspecified. The animus for this for me comes from these particular four quotes of William James, which I want to make time to read. The world is full of partial stories that run parallel to one another, beginning and ending at odd times. There may ultimately never be an all form at all, that the substance of reality may never get totally collected, that some of it may remain outside of the largest combination of it ever made. I am finite once for all, and all the categories of my sympathy are knit up with the finite world as such, and with things which have a history. And finally, and most importantly for how I'll proceed, it is almost a pity that so straight a bridge from abstract logic to concrete fact should not bear our weight. James's phrase that abstractions cannot bear our weight is especially resonant with why our theology of revelation might be strengthened by beginning from the body up, so that we can account for the multifariousness of reality that we ultimately can't articulate through abstractions. Theologies that cannot bear our weight are fragile, prone to collapse, and dependent upon inadequate apologetics and theodicies, such as what ultimately has become the consensus of McConkie's Seven Deadly Heresies, insisting upon stabilizing God, history, and the universe in order to reproduce the guarantee that a particular configuration of knowledge explains exhaustively the way things are. Beginning from the body up ensures theology can carry more weight and be held to a Jamesian account of experience. As situated revelations relates to the revelatory side of Scripture, for instance, Francine Benyon's description of Scripture as fragments offers a starting vocabulary that highlights the fragmentariness of our scriptural canon and revelation more generally. given that scripture, for instance, is dependent upon the pens, its relationship to the pens and personalities and settings in which it was authored, and also provides a kaleidoscopic but incomplete insight into the divine nature of things that an open canon invites us to consider. This is where what Donna Haraway calls radical historical contingency enters the picture. Promoting an understanding of history as an embodied and contextual project rather than a providential scheme is essential for resuscitating situated knowledges and revelations from universal knowledge claims. Historical theology as well as intellectual and cultural history become vital for situating our revelations in their appropriate contexts. As Haraway reminds us, our knowledge claims should be not unlocatable, but rather should be accountable to a history that faithfully renders the past to be not inevitable. That is what radical contingency means, that our theological past and present is the work of embodied decision makers in search of God and is not final or inevitable. What Haraway's essay applied to a Latter-day Saint context suggests is that our past theological decision makers are not necessarily wrong, but they are simply not exhaustive of all that remains possible with the vocabulary that they've given us to begin working with. Moreover, radical historical contingency holds us deeply accountable to past statements and we consider those that have caused grave harm. For instance, when we reimagine the Book of Mormon and we try to reread out of it problematic readings, we are still accountable deeply to that reception history, and we cannot erase it and pretend that it did not happen. This, I think, highlights what's most important for radical historical contingency, that we reclaim the embodied implications of our readings and theologies. It invites, as Haraway penetratingly asks, for us to consider with whose blood were our eyes crafted. Understanding that we are historically contingent beings in a bloodied world, yet that we are also sites of revelation and continuing divine progression, holds heaven accountable to earth and ensures that our theological bridges can bear our weight. As Marilyn Robinson pointedly tells us in her sort of literary aside about Cain and Abel, Cain killed Abel and the blood cried out from the ground, a story so sad that even God took notice of it. Maybe it was not the sadness of the story, since worse things have happened every day, every minute since that day, but its novelty that he found striking. In the newness of the world, God was a young man and grew indignant over the slightest things. In the newness of the world, God had perhaps not himself realized the ramifications of certain of his laws. For example, that shock will spend itself in waves, that our images will mimic every gesture, and that shattered they will multiply and mimic every gesture 10, 100, or 1,000 times. Cain, the image of God, gave the simple earth of the field a voice and a sorrow, and God himself heard the voice and grieved for the sorrow. So Cain was a creator in the image of his creator. Situated Revelations invites us to embrace the full implication that our mortal experience, the day for us to perform our labors, is a revelatory site full of grave moral implication and significance. Our materialities are catalysts for revelation, both for us and for God, no less than it was for Joseph Smith, whose formative revelatory experiences as a 14-year-old seeker and as a prophet and religion maker, Terrell Gibbons writes, were saturated in the physical, tangible, material, and the visible. Our revelatory selves should be understood in similarly material terms. I have a little bit more. There are important pastoral implications to this essay. By destabilizing our concept of embodiment and revelation to match what we actually encounter in the historical record, and by understanding the limitations of our language for locating divine or exalted bodies, we are better able to accommodate theologically the variety of individuals and experiences that make up our congregations. Historical volatility and radical contingency are the intellectual capital for creating a more inclusive ecclesiastical structure, inviting us to partialize our truth claims and indexing them to our present moment and to each of our embodied perspectives to make more room for those who differ from us. It also requires we concede that who exactly speaks for God and where they fit within the social strata deeply matters to what becomes God's word. Rather than operating as if a dislocated and disembodied yet somehow embodied divine being, a la Orson Pratt and Bruce R. McConkie, possesses all truth in an absolute mind, to borrow idealist language, we concede that truth claims must be accountable to the situatedness of the person speaking for God, Recognizing, as Eugene England highlights, that the persistent yet productive tension between the inchoate and the stabilized in our understanding of God provides an elastic and capacious space in which we can envision a Mormonism with multiple vocabularies for God. This in turn invites us to continually find new religious language through the revelatory sight of our own embodied divine knowledges. Thank you.
All right.
Sorry to interrupt this amazing panel, but I thought there would be an actual break earlier in the day where I can make an announcement, and those are chimerical at these kinds of conferences, of course. But quickly, I just want to invite everyone who's here to join us for dinner. We'll be having a catered dinner right here. I promise I have something for you, so please feel free to join us and then just stay for the plenary talk. But I also need to let you know that the doors, the public entrances are now locked on the building. So if you want to get out, good luck. You'll just need to go to the second floor, which is right below us, and just out the double doors that are on Ridge Road here. So you can get out, but you can't come back in without my assistance. So think about that carefully. All right, back to you.
All right. Go ahead.
Great. Yeah, thank you all.
Sorry, your favorite thing.
Yeah, I hate this thing.
And be sure when you answer to do it at the microphone so
Yeah.
that they can hear you.
Yeah, I wish I could ask you all questions, but Paul, I wanted to first make a suggestion and then ask a question. So just down the hill here for 40 years, Bert Dreyfuss gave lectures on the Brothers Karamazov, and he made rebellion and the Grand Inquisitor the heart of his interpretation of the novel. I think you'd really enjoy listening to those lectures. They're widely available online. I had a brief point that I think opens into a question. So you equated Ivan's rejection of God with atheism. But I don't think that's right. I think Ivan doesn't actually really offer a classic argument from evil. The conclusion of his argument isn't that God does not exist. The conclusion is that we ought to reject God's world and return the ticket. And that makes it a much more powerful argument. I also think that it brings Dostoevsky much closer to the anti-theodicy view than your reading acknowledges, because I think the response to Ivan's argument, even though it's not really an argument from against God's existence, the response is that the standpoint that lets you form an argument for and against God's existence is actually the problem, right? And that's the same standpoint we take up when we offer a theodicy. We take a detached standpoint. We no longer keep ourselves involved in the suffering of the world and alleviating the suffering of the world. And so I think Dostoevsky's response to Ivan is actually, you should stop doing theodicies. That's the wrong response. And I actually saw hints of that in your anti-theodicy argument, which wasn't really an anti-theodicy argument. It was an argument that we should be alleviating suffering, and that the love of God will help us to alleviate suffering. I guess that wasn't a question, was it? So do you agree?
Yeah, great recommend. I'll have to read up on those lectures. Those sound really cool. Yeah, I think atheist was probably just kind of a quick filler term. Maybe agnostic or, morally opposed to God, though perhaps believing would be a term. I need a shorter term for that, but I think you're right about that. Yeah, rebel. That's a good point. I should use that one. I would agree that he doesn't actually formulate a response to explain why suffering happens. I'd say it lines pretty well with skeptical theism, saying some reason does exist, but we don't need to propose what it is, because that can be harmful. Because I think that clearly if his thrust through Zosima and Alyosha is that God does exist and can fill us with love, then there's some kind of explanation out there for why God is doing it if he is good, but he doesn't play around with saying what it is. So I think, I don't know. Does that Is that reasonable?
We'll let the
Should I move on?
maintain the conversation later. Just so we can get, yeah, why don't we go George and then over here. So, yeah.
Thank you. That was fantastic. All 4 papers were so stimulating. And so I'm going to sort of make a comment and let any of you respond because it kind of, I think, applies to all of them. And it sort of connected at the very end something that Kyle said that is it Madeline or Maddie? Maddison. Sorry. It's not Madeline either. Maddison. Something that you said at the beginning that I thought was kind of interestingly echoed by something Kyle was saying at the end, especially about the Book of Mormon. Because what you said about the Book of Mormon got me thinking, not so much out of critique of what you were saying, but just sort of stimulating me. I thought it was so thoughtful to think about. You said, thinking about the Book of Mormon's salvational claims, and of course, and I thought, well, yeah, that verse is the one we want to rescue from the Book of Mormon. But then, of course, the Book of Mormon is famously contradicts its own universality in moments, and at least has been interpreted to be a racist text rather than one that is more inclusive. And I think one of the reasons why scholarship matters and artistic expression matters is that it kind of does what Kyle was talking about, right? It's a way of being faithful to the story or to the text, but in a way that pulls it forward by rethinking it, reshaping it, in some ways without necessarily contradicting it or slamming it down and wrestling it to the ground and saying, you got this wrong. Or, I mean, I guess what I want to say is that when you called, I really feel that's my role. But what I do feel you were saying, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, is that we should be creative in the way we respond to tradition. And that creativity, in my experience, is most evident in scholarship and what in the Jewish tradition is known as midrash and retelling stories, right? Which is what Dostoevsky's doing, and embodying them in artistic objects and in aesthetic experiences, because that's where the new contingencies of our lives are worked out, and where theology, I think, actually becomes meaningful. So I'm sort of singing praise to everything that was said today, because I thought you were all capturing something that I feel very instinctively, and I was trying to say also that, inductively embodied experience toward an understanding of God is a smarter way to go. And I think there's great power in responding. I guess all I'm trying to say is, and see if you agree, that we don't have to do something radically revolutionary or rebellious in the sense of offering new scripture and rejecting what we have. And I didn't think that's what you were calling for, but the idea of, because I think that runs the risk of what you were talking about, Kyle, of sort of turning. You said it better than I'm going to rephrase it, but you were talking about a kind of respect for and answerability for the reading traditions that we've inherited. It's not so much the text that matters in the end; it's the reading traditions that create the text, right? And so, if we create an American exceptionalism out of the Book of Mormon, or a racism out of the Book of Mormon, we have to own that interpretation, that interpretive tradition, but then we have to sort of work through why that's no longer viable today and why we're answerable to that past, but we're moving in a different direction. And I think that's the only way that a tradition continues through time anyway. I'm sorry, this is kind of a rambling set of comments, but I hope it's a testimony to how inspiring your thoughts were, but I'm curious what your responses are to anything I've said. So, do you agree?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking does it work now?
No, it's just for the.
Oh, okay. For the Q&A, sorry. In thinking about, reception history is so important because as we want to reauthor, and this is a problem that people will talk about, is that something will be reinvented, but people have been calling for that reinvention or reconceptualization, say in Book of Mormon studies, or specifically in church policy, and that history won't be accounted for in the act of change. and we will talk about, for instance, the Book of Mormon has a universalizing tone of race, which is what Richard Bushman, for instance, does in his rereading of the Book of Mormon in the 90s, that it's sort of in a context of a colorless conversation in the public conversation. But on the flip side, though, you have to do justice to the fact that the text did at one point mean what it did about Lamanites, quote unquote, and that then was mobilized against tens of thousands of Native American youth. And that actually was that was the meaning of the book. And we are accountable to that meaning not as something that we should reclaim, but as something that we are, that it does do some sort of, it limits what the text can mean. We can't reinvert 1,000-fold into the lives of people living today. And so that's what I'd say.
Yeah, if I could just, I think the issue, right, is that the texts are, I mean, this is true of biblical scholarship as well. The texts are extraordinarily complicated and contradictory, and I think, but they're also always inviting new readings and new retellings that you know. If you're familiar with Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, she talks about restoration as a kind of prophetic gesture that's both historic in the sense that it connects to the past, but it moves us in a new direction because we've retold the story, and it doesn't look like rejection. It looks like a kind of fidelity that's really fascinating.
Maddison, do you want to respond, and then we'll have one more question before dinner?
Yeah, I really loved Kyle's presentation, and as a feminist and as a queer theologian, it's interesting it's so fascinating to me that Kyle is in a completely different side of campus, and we're both talking about the same, like, what does it mean to have an embodied practice? And I would say it's more what I'm calling for is a yes and, that we do both the work of writing new scripture and new scriptural texts, and we reckon with what we already have. I just think that sometimes we get scared, and I get it, right? We get scared to deal with the really hard and grapple with the really hard things. But I love the example of Gensh in it's a text about re-engaging the text of Paul, or text of terror. And Gensh invites us to do the work of, like, how do we look something straight in the face and engage with it in its full complicity? And how do we find meaning in that? And then how do we rewrite it? I think our historiography of Mormonism is often more impactful in raising Mormons than, like, the texts themselves. And so it's sort of a yes and approach. We've got to engage with the texts, and we've got to make new ones. Because that's how you keep a faith alive. And if we don't, our faith is going to die. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you. It's a brief comment for Paul Bryner. I've recently read Brothers Karamazov and Dostoevsky also. It strikes me that the Grand Inquisitor's speech and statement is sort of like Lucifer's brief in the pre-existence, where he says that we will not give men free agency. We will take care of them. Everybody will be supplied with their means, the population. But he does say, but of course, he said, they will be taken care of in this life, but of course there will be no eternal life for them because they have not earned it. The Savior, it strikes me, rather says that, the way he responded to the temptations, for example, indicates that he wants to give mankind free agency and freedom, and that the large amount of suffering that results from that will be worth it in the end. You might have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, Dostoevsky's great. I probably don't deserve all these questions, but it's a fun topic. The Grand Inquisitor is a great read. I think you should all read it yourselves. Like, I wanted to get into it a lot more because it's a very nuanced text, but it really is kind of a steelman argument for, you know, Lucifer's plan, you might say, the restriction of agency, and how because free will was allowed in this life, as we see horrors occur, and it deals with a lot of the challenges with that. So I think that the reckoning with that is is kind of a cool spiritual experience, actually. And Jesus in the story actually doesn't say anything and ends by just giving a kiss to the man who's threatening to kill him. And I think that really the only thing to do is to silently hear it and respond with love, because there's not a great answer for why it had to happen. So I think it's powerful too, and I just encourage everyone to go read it. I'd like to hear more of your thoughts later after this.